Roland Hulme, welcome to Suit Up the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I am too. Now, one of the first things I have to ask you about is you described yourself in your bio as a digital Don Draper with a Hemingway complex. And I just have to say, I love that as like a nice little log line for who you are. But would you mind telling just a little bit about yourself to the audience?
Well, absolutely. Well, I actually am quite proud of that. I keep that as my personal brand because I come from an advertising and marketing background, but I've always wanted to be a writer since I was 9 years old. I've wanted to be a writer. My mother was a writer. My family go back in publishing 4 generations, and so
That's awesome.
It's something that's always meant a lot to me. But I went into advertising. What I learned in advertising, and I called myself a digital Don Draper because I was like the social media guy and coming up with these interesting ideas and pitches. And I worked in the ad agency environment, which is an addictive environment to work in. But I always wanted to write stories. I always wanted to write adventure stories, kind of like in the Hemingway mold. I also like a drink like Hemingway. So yeah, that was my brand. But it's the juxtaposition between advertising and marketing and writing and storytelling, which is just, I think these days works really well with people because people appreciate stories. They appreciate vulnerability and authenticity and all these different things. And it's nice that we live in an environment where we can actually have a platform to share that with people.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I love about the digital age, for as many times as I've said, oh, I'd be better off like in the 60s or something, is that we have this access where we can do things like self-publish. We're not bound to the same old constraints of the systems that existed. And now we have that opportunity to put ourselves out there. I'm curious, do you think that the background advertising helped you in your pursuit of becoming an author?
I think it absolutely did, because I realized that the keystone to being a successful author is to write books people want to read, and you have to understand what actually exists out there in the marketplace. And I think the magical part is when you get to tell the stories you want to tell in a format and a package that readers want to read, and knowing about marketing and knowing about why people react to certain things and being able to examine other products in the marketplace and build yours in a framework that works with that is really the sweet spot that makes being a full-time author something that is within people's reach.
I seem to remember, and this is one of the things that you get from advertising that you can really take and write large in stories, is that you need to capture someone's attention with a very short amount of words. And that hook is then what proceeds to draw them into a greater story.
Yeah. And I think I was just thinking of every single product that you like the slap chop. Do you remember the slap chop?
No.
Oh, these late night commercials where this guy would chop onions with this magical machine that was there. It went wild. People made huge amounts of money on it because you had this distinctive product that was presented to you in an interesting way that gave you the hook, and then you wanted to buy it. And I think books are no different. That your book, Reason and Romance, it's Jane Austen in a modern day setting from a male's perspective. That's a hook, that's a concept, that's interesting. And I think that's one of the most important ways to get readers, is to have something that makes them interested and want to find out more.
We mentioned Hemingway. I think it was Hemingway that said you only need like a few words to tell a good story. It was like for sale, baby shoes, unused, or something like that.
Yeah,
It's like
Hemingway's the master of that. He's what's it, the iceberg method,
the iceberg theory.
Yeah, that's it. You just tell just a little bit, but then with the context of what you can build up so much more backstory. Ian Fleming was brilliant at that.
So I want to get into all that, but one thing I want to touch on, because we've discussed when I was on your show, my cover is you are in an interesting situation with your book covers, because you write these bad boy motorcycle romance novels, which are incredible, the Knucklehead Motorcycle Club stories, and your covers very much are in that genre, but then you've also started releasing them in more what I'll call male friendly covers. Would you mind talking a little bit about that? Because I thought it was just interesting, because we have that story, that just the phrase judging a book by its cover is so accurate, and you've literally experienced that same story with different covers.
Well, it's funny because you wrote a romance book from a male perspective, and I started off writing romance books. I wanted to do something exciting. I wanted to tell an exciting story that was going to be something that's marketable. And I picked motorcycle club romance because that is a huge genre in romance.
Mm-hmm.
But it also, I've always, ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a cowboy. And I consider
Love
like these
that.
bikers are like modern day cowboys. If you like Bon Jovi, he's got a great line in a song where it's like, I'm a cowboy and a steel horse I ride.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, I can tell a modern day cowboy story with these
Yeah.
people riding Harley Davidsons. And I plotted out like an adventure story involving that, a really in-depth like thriller thing, but I just told it from the perspective of the love story. And that was like the focus. And it was really satisfying and enjoying to write. And then I love from the romance books. I grew up reading all my mother's romance books, and two of my favorite authors are Jilly Cooper and Fiona Walker. I don't think are very big in America, but they would have this large cast of characters in a specific place. One story would focus on two of the characters, one couple. The next book would focus on a different couple, but all of the characters would be in the periphery and part of the story. And so I created a cast of characters for book one, and then I could reuse them in other books and then tell a broader story and like have, you know, important themes you can explore. And I was like, this is really fun. It's like you get to create your own playground. And as I went on, I started to be really proud of these books, and I was writing under a female pen name because I believed, you know, that was going to make me more successful. But I had really enjoyed writing these books. They're commercially done really well. I've 68,000 copies I've sold so far.
Congratulations.
I had thousands of readers on my mailing list, and I came out. I was like, okay, guys, listen, I'm actually the person who wrote these Simone Scarlett books. And the readers on my list embraced me and they supported me. And it felt incredibly validating. And David Zaritsky from the Bond Experience, his wife, Danielle, who's wonderful, very kindly actually read High Point, which is the book I really loved the most. And the female version has this big shirtless guy with a sailor hat on. And she said, you know, it read like a screenplay, and David Rixey enjoyed it. And I was like, maybe guys would enjoy books like this, the books that I've written, because they mash together adventure and action and romance. And I think men actually love romance. We love love stories as well, because we want to be loved. We want to be accepted. So I did the market research. And High Point in particular was, you know, set on a boat, and Clive Cussler was quite a big inspiration for the action portion of that. So I designed a cover based on the elements that make Clive Cussler cover so successful and so recognizable, like the size of the typeface and this Photoshop image that I put together there, because I want to be a writer known for writing the books I want to do, having my own name attached to them, just like you do. And I just having a certain level of success and having people encourage me gave me the I don't know, boldness to actually do it.
I love it. I've read High Point and I've read a couple of the other books too, but I will definitely admit that when I download the other books and there's this large shirtless dude on the cover, like his abs glistening, I'm like, this seems like a book I wouldn't normally read. But it's just fascinating how we have that kind of, we just instantly think things that way, even though the content is the exact same. And I've loved, High Point was amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm like in the process, weirdly enough, I haven't finished I've read like 4 of your other books in like various stages. It's like I'm just trying to consume the entire series at once. And I'll be honest, that's one of those things that I suck at, is actually I read like 8 books at a time. And it drives some of my friends nuts because they're like, haven't you finished this yet? I'm like, well, no, because I'm also reading this one and I read that one. ADHD going off the wall. But one of the things I do love about the way you have designed your books is that you have this cast of characters. I mean, we think of world building because of Marvel and DC, but really in books, you can do such an amazing job when you create a series that's sustainable is by having this kind of cast of characters.
And what I found is the books then write themselves, literally, because High Point came along. I was trying to write another book that I wasn't quite in the space. And I woke up at 3 a.m. and I was like, oh my God, because I had written all of these other situations in the other books. And there was this center of conflict for like one particular phase of my books where these mysterious guys in black would find members of the Knuckleheads motorcycle gang and try and kill them. And I had written once throwaway line about this character called Max, who was nicknamed Popeye. And I figured, oh, somewhere out there, because I'd forgotten about him completely, is this guy Max, and presumably these same guys in black are going to try and kill him. What's the deal there? And so I had a story I had to tell, and so then I figured out like what's his deal, and I came up with a concept of him on the day of his divorce, but he still loved his wife, and the byplay between them, and then I got to have a boat in there, and you put these elements in, and then you just knew the characters well enough that their interactions would almost tell the entire story. And then you just have to put it into like the structure of a romance book. But the more you have a cast of characters and the more they interact with each other, the more they inevitably demand stories of their own. And that makes it so much more fun and involving to write.
Oh yeah, because then you start to love the characters. I mean, you actually helped inspire me. I wasn't planning to write a sequel to Reason and Romance, but one day, just out of the blue, I'm like, I know exactly what happens to this secondary character, and that's their story, and we're outlining it now. So thank you for that.
And that's the thing I think I really loved about Reason and Romance, is just the strength of the characters and the Frasier-like dialogue. And I've been rewatching Frasier, and like it's such an amazingly written show. Yeah. But then you're right, like Chelsea, I would love to learn what happens to her. Hopefully she's got, a romantic subplot.
Possibly. It's actually Helen who's going to take the main stage in the next story, but I would like to know what happens to Chelsea too. Really, all the characters I have a little degree of affection for. And I think that that's what makes shows like Frasier really strong, is that they do have an ensemble cast really of like, I heard there's one podcast I listened to called Critically Acclaimed. It's two movie critics. And they made the comment that when you have a strong character, the story writes itself. The example they used was Niles Crane.
Yeah.
Pitch Niles Crane goes to a rock concert. You instantly go, this is a moment for comedy, and you know how it's going to play out.
Yeah, because he's such a well-constructed character. It's almost like he's a computer program, and therefore how his computer program is going to operate in any given situation.
I just loved characters like that. And again, this is where I'm enjoying your books, is that I'm finding you have really well-crafted characters that I'm excited. Immediately when I finished High Point, I'm like, well, what happens to Max next?
And that's what makes it exciting. And there is going to be another story. And I've got 10 books in my head already planned out, and one involving Max and the High Point, and they go off to Mumbai of all places. You'll be interested with that one. But yeah.
Did I hear accurately that you've actually seen the High Point? Because this is a real ship.
Yeah, this is the thing. I wrote another book called Branded by the Modern Day Pirate. And when I was writing that, I said, I'm going to write a pirate story because my female audience will love a pirate story. And I was like, I'll set it as a modern day pirate story because I don't want to do the research. And I was like, okay, Caribbean doesn't really have pirates. Somalia just doesn't think of. So I came up with all these elements, but I knew I needed a pirate ship. And so I literally went online and was like, for decommissioned military vessels, where can I find one? And there was this brilliant Italian patrol craft that made the perfect pirate ship. And I did the same thing with the High Point. I was like, I want to write another sea adventure, and I googled which decommissioned military vessels were available for sale in the United States, and this ship came up for $40,000. It was described as a 100-foot yacht, and I was like, that looks a bit army-ish. And it was this former experimental hydrofoil created by Boeing in cooperation with the US Navy that could reach like 67 knots, and it was called the High Point, and this was the ship that was for sale. And I was like, holy crap, that's exciting, I want to write. And so the High Point became a character in the story. I had this wild dream that the book was going to do so well I'd be able to buy the High Point myself, but that didn't happen. But I know the guy, he's called Neil Beach, who actually owns the High Point now and is restoring her. So I haven't seen her yet. But one day I hope to actually stand on the deck at the High Point and be like, wow, this is amazing.
Well, it's details like that I think just lend so much more authenticity to the story, is when there is that real avatar, that thing that is both in the real world and the story world. That's fascinating. I mean, I think that we feel that way with James Bond books and locations usually, like the Orient Express is that physical thing that crosses between fiction and fact. And in this case, the High Point is that for you.
And I really enjoy using, my books I tend to have a lot of inspiration from places I've visited. I mean, I used to write a different series, and I set one in Spain because I've been to Spain and I've been to these places, this very remote wine in area that, you know, it's not a tourist destination unless you love wine, but it made such a vibrant backdrop. And a lot of the stories are set in like upstate New York, which is a place I love, or Paris, which is a place I used to live. I love writing about New York because when you live there and you know it and you're familiar with these places, that makes them exciting to write about.
And for people that don't know, your background is the Eiffel Tower.
Yes, and ironically, I'm calling from New York, and I'm from Britain, so like I have this weird juxtaposition. But I worked in Paris on and off for like 4 years. My parents still live in France. I absolutely adore it, and that's another Hemingway thing. I mean, Hemingway, you know, he called Paris a movable feast. So for me, there's a little bit of Paris that goes everywhere. My wife put this up. My wife's an incredible interior designer, so. You actually talking about that, about real life elements. I'll say my cheat code with this book, because I had Max there as a character for my series that I knew how to write about. And then I actually literally like took my wife and made her a character in my story, and took my eldest son, made him a character, took my father-in-law, made him a character. I needed the character of Wyatt Pratt. I needed the lawyer. And I actually have a friend called Wyatt Pratt, who's a lawyer who used to be in the Navy. And I lifted him. I don't know if I've confessed this to him, but they're all fictional versions, but I just, because I knew these characters in real life, I put them there, and it was almost, Gore Vidal said every writer has a cast of like 10 characters.
Yes.
And each book they write, they dress them up as different characters in their story, but it's always the same like imaginary actors. So I just used imaginary actors from people who I really know, and just in my head visualize them living this adventure.
Which is brilliant. I mean, I read Graham Greene made a comment about every writer has a piece of glass in their heart, where it doesn't matter what situation you're in, it becomes a potential for story. I've already warned all my friends that if anything about them or similar to them shows up in my book, listen, it's just because you know me. I'm sorry, it will potentially show up.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. My wife doesn't read any of my books. I always say if she reads this one, she'll probably divorce me, because she'll be like, wait a second, this character, I know who this character is. But then at the end of the day, it's all about being in love with that particular heroine. And the conflict is such a, because you need conflict for a story. And then, that's the most difficult part. I mean, we want to live in a peaceful life. We don't want to have conflict. We don't want to have difficult situations. But those are what may give you the experience to be able to write about stuff.
Well, and I'm curious your opinion on this, because this is something I know that I've always struggled with a little bit, is that moment where I'm like, oh, I have to make my character suffer. And especially if you like your characters, you're like, okay, I don't want to like make it too bad. But at the same token, we've got to start putting some consequences in here.
Yeah, and it is really difficult. Especially because I have recurring characters. Sometimes I'll have a couple from a previous book, and you left them with a happy ever after. And then you're like, well, if I'm going to write about them again, they need to get unhappily ever after and then get back together, which I think works in real life, though. I mean, I think in life, you can be married to someone for 20 years and fall in love with them 3 times and fall out of love with them 3 times. And then, so you have different love stories within a single love story. Happily ever after isn't the end of the story.
No, come on. What's the name of, I can't remember who said it, but basically the only way to know when the story is happy is happily ever after depends on where you end the book.
Yeah.
And that is one of those things that I love. There's only one line in Reason and Romance that I'm genuinely proud of. Like I would, if I did tattoos, I'd have tattooed on my body. It was romance is always delicately balanced on the edge between comedy and tragedy. Yeah. And I think that's what makes love work, is that it is that range of either joy or sorrow. And that's why, like we discussed Shakespeare briefly when I was on your show. That's what makes Shakespeare work, is that is that question of tragedy or comedy in so many of his romances. Yeah.
I mean, what's that old line about comedy is just tragedy plus time?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. And so many of the elements, in a romantic comedy, they're hilarious. But then if you put them into another context, they're horrible. I mean, I think you can do that with any love story, like 50 Shades of Grey. If Christian Grey was poor and fat, it would be an episode of NCIS.
Accurate. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, because you are basing things around this motorcycle club, are you a big motorcycle fan? And tell me a little bit about this, because I am a neophyte when it comes to motorcycles, but I'm still a dude. I still look and go, wow, that's cool.
Uh, I will admit I can't currently ride a motorcycle, and that's one of my things I'm going to do. But I loved the whole idea of on a steel horse I ride.
Mhm.
The motorcycle culture I think is fascinating. I love cars though. I'm a car nut. I always like driving old cars. I've
Okay.
posted pictures of my stupid
So
Lincoln car.
go-to classic car. Do you have a preference?
Yeah, I mean, I've owned fortunately quite a few classic cars that I really love. Like the MGB, which is a 1960s like two-door coupe. It was called the poor man's Aston Martin. Like that was a wonderful car to own, and things were always going wrong with it because British cars are always falling apart. But I adored it, and I've owned just a stack of 80s American cars, like the Firebird from oh, what is it, Knight Rider. I've owned
Oh
like three of those.
yes, the
Yeah.
Trans Am. My goodness, my uncle, my great uncle had one of those convertible Trans Ams. I just remember that my heart broke the day he sold it. I'm like, but why can't I buy it? Well, you're 14, and obvious reasons.
And I
But
love it as well because if something goes wrong with an old car, I can fix it. And that to
mhm.
me, that's almost like therapy. I enjoy that. So, you know, if something's broken, you figure out what it is. You've got that detective thing where you have to work out what's broken about it, and then you fix it. So, writing about motorcycles got me really interested in motorcycles, and I started off knowing nothing. So it was called the Knuckleheads Motorcycle Gang, and I was going to be like, and the signature ride is going to be the Harley Davidson Knucklehead, and it's like, oh, actually, it turns out that Harley Davidson only made the Knucklehead engine between 1942 and 1947, so that's not going to work. And then I found out more about bikes, and I started to just love and appreciate the artistry and the history and the heritage and the culture that goes with bikes. But most of all, I think the thing that's amazing is they're, am I allowed to swear on your show?
Yes, I'll put the E for explicit. The moment someone drops a swear word, I just hit
Well,
that. We're
okay,
fine.
I'll use it, but they're flipping scary.
Uh-huh.
Like riding on a motorcycle is incredibly terrifying experience. It's exhilarating, it's
Mhm.
dangerous, it's stupidly dangerous. And I mean, it's exciting. I grew up riding horses, and to me there's nothing more exhilarating than galloping on a horse at like 40 miles an hour, and you're like, holy crap, anything goes wrong, I could die, this is amazing. And on a motorcycle you're doing it at 70 miles an hour on something that weighs 700 pounds, and it's like, yeah.
In Flint and French Kiss, you have this chase sequence in the book, and I felt that reading that scene, just the speed and the velocity of these characters zipping down this highway, and it was definitely one of those where I'm like, okay, I need to drink some water because that was heart pounding.
Oh, well, that's incredibly flattering of you to say thank you. And I'm really, yeah, that was an exciting scene writing it. But I think that's it. The reason female readers like motorcycle romance books is because there is nothing more exhilarating than riding on the back of a motorcycle at ridiculous speeds. And there's nothing sexier than a guy who leaves you exhilarated. And that's why there is this compelling element to motorcycle riders or bikers. But I also love the idea of these motorcycle gangs operate outside the law. But what if there was
Mhm.
a gang that operated outside the law, but had a certain nobility to it?
Yeah.
They broke the law and they lived illegally, but they did what was right and had a moral core. And I kind of ended up putting myself into the situation where where I had my characters have to make decisions about doing what's right or what's wrong, based not on the law, but on, you know, a sense of true morality or a sense of goodness. And I enjoyed writing that, putting them in the situation where they had to make really difficult choices.
Well, and there are two ideas that I love that I've seen in your books. And again, I haven't read all of them yet, but two concepts that I love that have been reoccurring, which is the grand narrative, which I love because that's very much in my frame of reference. I'm a Christian, but I look at everything as a story, that it is all one gigantic story, and everything, for me, that makes sense for my context of viewing. Okay, that's how God's a writer, and everything is all the little subplots, all the little threads. And the other idea is that no one rides for free. And I just love those two concepts. Would you mind talking a little bit about them?
Absolutely. Well, the great narrative, I love that, because to me, sometimes you're going through stuff in life and you're like, oh my God, this is awful. How am I ever going to get out of this? And then you just remember, like in a story,
Mm-hmm.
conflict and suffering is something that a character can either be destroyed by or triumph over. And it makes you think, okay, I'm going to make the decisions to try and triumph. This is a story. If you think of life as a story, then it means there's a context and a meaning to the bad parts, because the bad parts are going to be interspersed by the good parts. And hopefully we've all lived a life where if you ended the book at that point, it would be a happily ever after.
A quick question, just to interrupt there. Do you ever feel like, I've had a couple of friends that have had a few rough points, and admittedly, there's that part of me after having written a book and studying writing so much. I look at their situations and I look at some of my own situations, judge them the same way, but I'm like, oh, this is that point in the story where you're going down to Hades. Don't worry, like in 3 to 4 chapters, you'll go back up. Do you ever feel that way when you're in those situations where you see other people going through those situations?
Absolutely. And I'll say a lot of my books, some of the situations that the male characters go through are situations I was going through at a particular time. And I think what I enjoy about being able to write romance is traditionally romance is written by female authors, and their female characters can explore really important issues, and their male characters perhaps are a little more of a blank slate. And we as male authors get to tell the same romance stories, but give context that is meaningful to us about the male characters. And there are things that you suffer. Every book, it's almost like therapy as I work through something. Like French Kiss and Flint, obviously the main character is going through PTSD and depression and all of this stuff, and that was really what he was trying to conquer as you go through. And being able to write about that stuff, sometimes it's like, my life sucks this moment, so I'll make my character's life suck at this moment, but as I write my character out of this, for some reason that is mirrored in my own life as I follow that path out there and realize the down part of the story doesn't negate the good part of the story. And
I think that Dr. Jordan Peterson in his self-authorship course has actually like talked about a similar idea, where people that are not authors by any stretch, but being able to put their story into a context and then project forward, this is what I'd like my story to be. It gives them that feeling of self-responsibility and control. I know there's a better word for it. They take ownership, in essence, of their narrative.
Accountability.
And yes. And I love that part about being an author.
Which leads on to the philosophy of the Motorcycle Club, which was everybody carries their weight, nobody rides for free. And that's a philosophy I've adopted. I always claim that my father taught me this, but I don't. He says I never said that. Last time I mentioned it, but it was like, the money is meaningless unless you earn it. And I think it's because I grew up in a quite affluent upper class British background, and so I had a bit of a chip on the shoulder about I want to be my own person and pay my own way. And that's part of the dream for me coming to America, was like you start off with $500 in your pocket, and can you make a life for yourself that makes getting out of bed every single morning worthwhile? And I think personal responsibility is a good philosophy to have, and I think it's a good philosophy for men to embrace. And that's become the philosophy of my Motorcycle Club. Like, everybody carries their weight. You have to be responsible and be able to look after yourself, and nobody rides for free. You have to contribute and provide value. It's a life philosophy that I think resonates with people. And it's funny because Jordan Peterson talking about controversial people, which is funny because I found a huge amount of value in his book 12 Rules for Life and stuff like that. But he expresses how important personal responsibility is, especially to young men, because we live in a society where if you aren't providing value, if you don't wake up in the morning and think I'm adding something to this world, you can wonder why you get out of bed in the morning at all. And it's a lifelong struggle. And so hopefully people who read my book will be like, oh, I appreciate this philosophy.
Well, one of the things I do like about your male characters is they aren't just these stock, despite the covers, they aren't just these ripped muscle dudes. They're actually real people with real conflicts and situations that they embody a lot of those key masculine traits, I think, like taking responsibility, like having their own code. And I think what's fascinating is basically it's some of the context you see these extremely masculine characters that are floored by the right girl. And I think that's part of what we love about romance.
I have a rule with my romance books that it's like you have to fall in love with your heroine. And I think at that point, then I think if you really truly fall in love with somebody, they won't make you change, but you will want to be a better person for them. I say I have so many friends who are now divorced, who are in toxic relationships where their wife was like, you got to give up drinking, you got to stop doing this, you got to stop doing that, and trying to control them. And that's why the relationship didn't work. But if somebody has a flaw and they find the right person who they really love, they will want to overcome that flaw in themselves because they want to be a better person, not because she tells them to do that. And so I try and have that in my stories.
there's a meme circulating online because, again, I love Jane Austen, so I follow like all the Jane Austen memes on Instagram. And one of them was the reason Jane Austen survives is because her ethos was not the, oh, he's flawed, therefore I will fix him. Her ethos was, he's flawed, he can go fix himself if he actually wants to be with me.
Yeah. And then also sometimes there are things that you don't necessarily need to fix about yourself. At High Point, you know, the female, the lead character is actually quite unlikable. But part of the thing is he loves her regardless. And I think that sometimes there are people in your life who aren't going to be exactly what you want them to be. You're never going to find the perfect person because the perfect person doesn't exist. So you have to learn to live with the things that are wrong about them and still love them.
And that's one of the things I do like about High Point in particular, is that you have, at one point, your female protagonist does what I would consider almost completely unforgivable. And you have to sit there and go, but he still loves her anyway, despite that. And I've grown up with the context of believing love is a choice. It's not something that it is an emotion and a feeling, but real love is something you choose. And you make that choice every time, in good times and in bad times. That's the reason for those vows that people make. So I appreciate that in your books, it very much does focus on the idea of the characters consciously choose to love each other.
And the other thing I think with Max, you know, his wife goes on, disapproves of drinking throughout the entire book. And I very much wanted to be that he continued drinking throughout the entire book, because sometimes if you can keep your shit together, these are bad habits you don't need to change. Everyone needs some vices. Oscar Wilde said, what is it? The worst thing is somebody who has no vices. That's
true. Well, and actually, that's an interesting thing, because I wanted to ask you what your favorite beverage of choice is. But then also in the context of High Point, she doesn't approve of the drinking. He does continue to drink. Little things like that add so much texture to the story. So I just want to say I appreciate that. But what is your go-to beverage?
You know, I invented a cocktail for High Point. It is, you get a tin cup. I don't have one here. It is like cheap white Bacardi rum with dollar store orange juice served in a tin cup and stirred with a 13mm spanner, a wrench. And the reason you have it, well, the metal cup is because on a ship, you don't want to have glass cups because they'll shatter. And that's a cocktail I invented. And when I wrote High Point, I drank a considerable amount of that. But I have to admit, I'm a lager lout. I'm a beer person more than anything. I enjoy beer and I love bourbon. I love Scotch whiskey. I'm a bad Scotsman because I actually prefer bourbon. I love bourbon. And I love all of the different types of bourbon that you have across America now with the craft industry coming up. Like Indiana has some fantastic bourbons. There's a bottle of bourbon in each of my books as an Easter egg.
Ooh, that is a great little Easter egg. See, that's one of those things, like I mentioned before, that in another conversation we had, that I like to have certain themes show up in my books. One of them is I have this grand idea for having whiskey just subtly in the background, and then eventually I will write an entire romance novel devoted to whiskey. So we'll see how that goes. But one other thing that, before we get away from High Point too much, because I want to talk to you about some of our favorite fandoms, is you have written one of the characters in the story, the son has ADHD, is neurodivergent. And as someone who has family members like that, and am often that way myself, I appreciated that you wrote it well. And that's something I think that you have to be congratulated on, because I have seen it written poorly in so many other contexts and places.
Well, that means a lot for you to say that. I mean, I said I basically took characters from real life, and my son is on the spectrum, but he's very functional. But I literally was like, what if you had him and put him in this situation? And because I knew him so well, I could understand the things he would freak out about, but also the things where he would step up and be amazing at, like fixing the computer thing, about having the pride as a kid who, you know, is always in trouble because he can't, for things he can't control, like ADHD and being on the spectrum. He's always getting yelled at. He's always being told off for not complying. To have somebody like Max give him the responsibility for learning how to pilot a ship and stuff like that, it felt really good to be able to write about that. And hopefully one day, when he's old enough, because of all the sex that goes in the book, my son will read that and see how I saw him when he was 11 years old, and the points, that the things about what he was doing that he didn't need to feel bad about, and the things in him that I saw were amazing, and I just wanted to like tell him. And you know, I'm terrible, I'm British, I have no capacity for face-to-face human interaction emotionally with other people, but I can write about it. That's, yeah.
You're British, what can I say? I love that. It's so great that you were able to do that. And as someone who reads a lot of books, I think there's always that part of me when I see a kid like introduced as a secondary character, as part of me it cringes, like, oh no, I've seen this in the movie where it just sucks. But you did it so well. You did so well, and I enjoyed that character in High Point instead of feeling like he was a burden or an annoyance. It was just well done, tactful, and I enjoyed it.
Oh, well, I really appreciate that. And one of the things was like, he was thrown into the situation he wasn't ready for, but everybody carries their weight. Nobody rides for free. So he carried his weight and he learned to provide value. And that was, yeah, I think that's his character arc.
So we have some favorite fandoms that we both have, which I love. And before we talk about Indiana Jones, James Bond, or Frasier, I have to ask you about The Saint, because here is a criminally underrated and under talked about franchise material. And I just want to ask you about your love of The Saint, and then I'll ask you a few more questions after that about The Saint. But where did you come across Leslie Charteris?
So The Saint is my first love, I would say, like even before James Bond. Everyone knows me for being a fan of James Bond, but the Saint books by this author called Leslie Charteris, he started writing them in 1928. To me, just I adored them. I was a teenager, I think, and I used to start writing stories, and I would write private eye fiction and stories about people racing around in old cars. And my father was like, "You should really read The Saint." And he gave me a book, The Saint in New York. And The Saint, it's the writing, it's very archaic now, but it's like beautifully poetic. You've got this character who is 6'2", tanned, devilishly handsome, his sparkling blue eyes. He's always immaculately dressed. He says he's witty and charming and smiles, which is not like James Bond, who was the blunt instrument. He was an amazing, vivid, larger than life character who righted wrongs. He operated outside the law. The whole thing I love about the Knuckleheads, being a gang who does the right thing outside of the context of the law, being anti-heroes, that's what The Saint was. But he was always charming and romantic and brilliant. And I read every single Saint book I could, and I just adored them. And certain elements with that, the world travel, because Leslie Charteris, he traveled the world, and so he wrote about these places. There's a wonderful interview with him. You should YouTube it. He was one of the first passengers on the Hindenburg. Oh. And if you Google Leslie Charteris in the Hindenburg, he'll tell you about the 4-day journey it took to get across the Atlantic in the Hindenburg. But they were wonderful, wonderful stories. And of course, they had this great TV show in the 60s with Roger Moore, who later on became James Bond. They had the 70s with Return of the Saint with Ian Ogilvy. Some less successful approaches after that. But The Saint to me is just like chef's kiss. And I read The Saint in New York and I said, "Dad, I'm going to go to New York one day." And so he's regretted giving me that book ever since.
I haven't read all of the Saint books. Actually, I think that people would be surprised. There are a lot. There's at least 30, right?
I think there are close to 60. And
yeah,
there are some that are only available in French, for example. I have a bunch of them that
really
he wrote in French because he was fully bilingual and only exists in that context.
That is so interesting. I didn't know that. But his books are fascinating. I've always loved this swashbuckler persona. I mean, that's why it's in my bio. That's why I call myself professional author, amateur swashbuckler, because I love like the Scarlet Pimpernel. And I feel like The Saint is almost like I say modern, but for the time, it was like a modern version of that Scarlet Pimpernel, where it's this charismatic leader who has a gang of other swashbuckling young guys who are going and doing these adventures.
Especially the early ones had an ensemble cast. The later ones didn't. They were almost like product, but the early ones had an ensemble cast, and they had things like the Saint's best friend was in love with the Saint's girlfriend. And it was that added a kind of context you don't normally get in action adventure stories. And they sacrificed themselves and they stood up for something. And also the context of when the books were written around between World War I and World War II. And
which is such a unique time.
Yeah. I mean, World War I was just such a horrific event, and it had left Europe so devastated and had made so injurious to the psyche of humanity. Hemingway wrote so much about the lost generation. And so the rights that they were trying to write were to prevent another war. And it was unfortunate that just a few years later, war would break out again.
There's one of the Saints, I think it's the Avenging Saint that I read. So I listened to the audiobook versions. Audible went through and did a whole bunch of them at some point. Marvelously well narrated, but they always have like a foreword either by a fan or by who's a writer or from Charteris himself. And I think the Avenging Saint, he has like a note beforehand, he's like, listen, I wrote this just before World War II. And the whole plot is them like trying to stop basically an atomic bomb before there was an atomic bomb from going off. And it was fascinating and enjoyable. I think The Saint's underrated, like I said. And I'm curious from your perspective, since you are a fan of not only The Saint, but also James Bond. I think it's interesting to see some of the parallels and disparate elements between Charteris and Fleming.
Absolutely.
Where do you think The Saint needs to go to get to? Because I think he's a James Bond level character that isn't there. Why do you think that is? And what do you think could get him to that point?
Well, first, I'm just going to reach over here for 1 second.
Miracle post-production.
I'm obsessively in love with The Saint. And one of the things that I'm proudest of is this particular book, Send for the Saints, the re-release. It has, if I could, forward by Roland Hulme. I know. I have my name in the Saint book.
Congratulations.
I'm fortunate enough to actually know a guy who was personally friends with Leslie Charteris, and so I had that, and that's so exciting. I mean, you have forwards written by like Pierce Brosnan, no, I don't know, very famous people anyway, and
Lee Child, stuff like that. Yeah.
So that was massively exciting. But
that's awesome. You have just like gone up several points of cool in my mind.
I'm just lucky. It's just something I've been passionate about, and I had the opportunity because of a friend of mine, Ian Dickerson, who's a great writer and historian of things, and was a friend of Leslie Charteris. But yeah, that's something I'm excited. I have my place, tiny little flag in the world of The Saint now. But why is The Saint not as popular these days as James Bond? And it's interesting because a few years ago they tried rebooting the Saint, and they had a movie that was, to be honest, terrible.
Yeah. I saw it on Netflix.
I know, and I feel so bad. It's the movie itself. It was originally shot as a pilot episode, so it's like 40 minutes long, and then the pilot didn't get picked up, so they added an extra 20-30 minutes of footage in
and
which
you
he
can
has
tell
a beard.
the reshoots, yes, when everyone looks a little different.
Yeah, I mean, he literally has a beard through 20 minutes of the movie, and The Saint never had a beard. He was always clean shaven. So it was unfortunate it didn't work. But I think part of it is the fact that The Saint was always written to be larger than life and perfect in every way. Less so in the early books, but as they got later on, it was like he was 6'2", always immaculately dressed. He won every fight. He was a world-class
Roger Moore
driver.
was the perfect avatar of.
Yeah, but I think in many ways, the James Bond we see on screen is The Saint that we read about in the books, because especially in the Roger Moore days, he was ridiculously capable at this, ridiculously capable at that. Even Sean Connery, they would joke about how he would know obscure things that you couldn't possibly know.
I was referring to the original vintage from which the story was based.
And George Lazenby has that line where he comes in and goes, "That's unusually large for Ampolus polychloris." It's like, "I didn't know your skills extended to Lepidoptery 007. It's like he's an expert in everything, and it just makes him not compelling to read about necessarily as a character in today's more cynical, authentic age. And I don't, for some reason, I think the James Bond franchise has done quite well by toning it down. Timothy Dalton was a more flawed hero. Pierce Brosnan, they had some interesting characterization there. Daniel Craig was all about that. And because you have a more human character, I think people relate to him more. Whereas The Saint, it would be difficult to make him come on the screen in a believable way, I think.
Do you think like a Netflix miniseries that was set in period would work?
That's possibly a really interesting idea. But in some ways, I love the idea of there being a modern day Saint, because we live in a world where horrible things happen all the time, and there are people who are wrong or right, and the country is so polarized, and the people on the left are completely crazy, the people on the right are completely crazy, and then we exist in this little
in the middle.
And I have friends who are conservative and friends who are liberal, and I can still be friends with them because there are more important elements, comradeship and careless laughter. The James Bond community, we have super liberal people and feminists and all sorts of people who love the fandom. We have super conservative people who are into guns and stand for Republican positions who love the fandom, and we find a way to be friends and exist in a peaceful, happy community. And to me, that's one of the things that maybe would be great about reintroducing the Saint, is just having a sense of nobility and having a sense of decency and empathy to your fellow man.
Well, and that's one of the things that, again, I haven't read all the books, but I've read like the first five. And the Saint as a character, he embodies that kind of, he is larger than life, and he has that kind of swashbuckling, Errol Flynn, devil may care attitude that it stands above all the pettiness. There's another series I've started reading called the Legendary Lyman Chronicle, The Chronicles of Legendary Lyman by Dorothy Dunnett. Fantastic series so far, but he, again, as a character, just exists as larger than life, swashbuckling, and above the politics of whatever's going on around him. And I love characters like that. And I think it would be interesting to see the Saint brought back, because again, I think that's a really good character that just needs like the right actor and the right writer.
And I think there are certain real life situations. Like, do you remember that farmer bro or something? He was the guy whose venture capital thing took over a particular brand of drug and increased the price 900%.
Oh,
it's like, it didn't matter if you're on the left or the right. You were like, that guy's an a-hole. And wouldn't it be satisfying to have a saint-like character somehow make this guy have to face repercussions for his hubris?
So, and you see stuff like that. I've mentioned to you before that one of my favorite books is The Count of Monte Cristo. And that's one of the things I'm so glad that you also are familiar with the book, because I can nerd out a little bit with you on it. The thing I love about that book is that the Count brings people to task for not just not the things that they did to him necessarily, even though that's the reason he's going after them, but because they are horrible people, have done horrible things throughout their lives. And he just finds the right people that did something, and he just pushes the right pieces in place and lets them be the folly of their own destruction. And I think the Saint has a very similar MO in how he went about things.
Absolutely. It's not cold-blooded revenge. It's a game of chess where they all end up becoming victims of their own hubris. And in some ways, I think the Count of Monte Cristo, he was an archetype. He was a prototype for who the Saint would be, because there was a context to why he was an amazing swordsman and spoke all these different languages, because he learned these things in prison. But if you just started telling his story without any of that context, he would seem larger than life and too good to be true, like the Saint was. But maybe there is a context. What we understand now why is there. And the satisfaction you get from the people getting their own comeuppance and betraying each other and their lies coming to light, and it's wonderful. It's so satisfying to read.
As like, I've got my author goals, the books that I will write before I die. I'm not good enough yet, but I want to write a modern Count of Monte Cristo, just because I feel like it is a book that has such timeless elements that it fits in any age.
Yeah, and I love that. I was speaking about in the Hidden Gems podcast about taking something that is familiar to people and then giving it a new twist. And I think right now that's some people really want that. I mean, I wrote one romance novel called Codename Mistletoe, and it was Die Hard as a romance novel, because you got to take all those elements and create something completely new with new characters, but it provides people with something that is timeless and resonates with so many people, and you tell it in a new and interesting way.
I'll be completely honest. I've been saving that book for Christmas. I am looking forward, because I don't know about you. I love reading stuff based on the seasons. So if there is like a good holiday movie or book, like Hercule Poirot Christmas is the one I read last year. So I always like to pick something that's that Christmas edition to read around that time of year. So you are actually the book I'm going to read this year.
Oh, well, I'm flattered. It shouldn't take you too long. It's quite a short book, it's action packed. But I love that. I always say, I'm going to write a Halloween book this year, and I always publish it in November. That's fun. But taking what's familiar and reinventing it, I think that's what you love, and what makes things work and what makes things timeless. But also, that's why you wrote a book that is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, except it's still fresh and new and zesty and meaningful, and appeals to people who like that, and they can appreciate all of the different things that you've done, all of the Easter eggs you kind of like sewn into the patchwork of it.
We tried. You've seen Stranger Things, I'm guessing.
Yes.
I mean, that's, I think, the ultimate example. I think I've also used Indiana Jones, but like, I think that above anything else at this point is like the perfect example today's day and age of taking all these things that we recognize and remixing into literally its own thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is limitless scope to do that. I mean, to think of the movies that came out, we've got Spider-Man No Way Home, and that had the elements that appealed to nostalgia so much in almost a shameless way, except they were brought in to people like me watching it. It was incredibly satisfying to watch, because the vagaries of the movie industry had left these threads hanging and left these unsatisfying ends to these characters who you had affection for, and then you got to see their things closed up, and it was really, really satisfying and rewarding. And I don't think it was all based just on nostalgia. I think it was based on retelling in a new way something that had come before.
I'm curious, are there any book series that ended prematurely that you wish had been finished? Because I'm going to ask you a little bit about James Bond here in a minute. And I think that almost to a degree, The Man with the Golden Gun kind of feels that way to me, in that it is that kind of unfinished version that we ended up getting of what Fleming was going for. But are there any other series that you are a fan of that didn't necessarily have the end because the author, say, passed away before finishing or anything along those lines?
I can't think of any that ended before their time off the top of my head, because I think, like a lot of readers, I'm like, oh, if the series didn't end, I'm not going to start reading it. But I remember I really appreciated Stephen King's The Dark Tower series. And when he got, and halfway through that, there was a 4-year gap between books. Then he got hit by a car. We're like, you cannot die until you finish the series. Like, this would be the worst thing ever. I've invested so much in this. And then fortunately he did. Game of Thrones, the author there, George R.R. Martin, it's like everyone's terrified that he's going to die before he ends his book series.
There's another actually great example of remixing stuff. I just got into Game of Thrones last year and watched the show. And of course, I knew I was going to be disappointed as we got later, but I didn't realize how much they had been working from just amazing source material for all the stuff I enjoyed. And then I'm a big fan of The War of the Roses. I love English history. I love imbibing it. So actually, the moment I started watching this, I'm like, oh, I know where he took that from history, that from history, that from history, that story. And I even read a book on the Wars of the Roses recently. I'm like, oh yeah, he really did crib.
And the brutality of that period in history. A lot of people have criticized Game of Thrones because they're like, why do you have to have all of the rape and mutilation and murder and stuff? And it's like, well, that's what history was like in that time. And it's yeah. And you need to. There was one of my other favorite authors, Wilbur Smith, who
yes,
I've
read the 2 of the Courtney books. I've read the first 2. I need to keep reading the series, but they changed audiobook narrators on me, and I'm like, oh, I was missing the old guy.
And that's a tough one. His second to last book was about slavery in America. Well, was set in the period of slavery in America. And the thing is, you end up in a situation where you can write about. You have to tone down the real life horribleness of it all, because all readers it's not gonna resonate with them. It's like you're sanitizing it. Whereas I think with Game of Thrones, it was just presented with the sheer brutality and the sheer nastiness, and all of his characters were so nuanced because they did unforgivable things and yet did then things that made you sympathetic with them. And so if he dies before the series has ended, there are going to be so many people who are just left unsatisfied.
I'm just starting to read the books. And so I'm like, okay, I've got time. George R.R. Martin, you've got time to get the last one out before I'm ready for it. So here's fingers crossed.
Then he can leave everyone unsatisfied if he gets it wrong.
Exactly. Well, and there's the thing. It's really hard sometimes to land the ending. There are so many series as trilogies. I mean, I've talked to you about Indiana Jones. I think that the first 3 movies are perfect.
Yeah.
But usually like that final film just sucks. Like even James Bond. It's so hard for them to end an actor's tenure well. I know a lot of people don't like No Time to Die. I enjoy it, but I think that the one thing no one can say differently is it has an ending, the most satisfying conclusion for an actor. As a movie, it's the best movie for a final actor.
Yeah, and I respect that. I mean, I would have liked him to have a happy ever after, almost like the end of
Batman, no, Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah, where he's sitting there at the cafe. Like, I would have liked that to be the ending, but I respect it. And I think it came from Daniel Craig.
He does not want to be asked ever again if he's playing James Bond.
Yeah. And I respect that, though. And I think one of the things is, as a creative person, you can't please everyone within your audience. Yep. And so you need to tell the story that you want to tell. And sometimes that means doing things in ways that people aren't going to particularly like. There's a character in my series who's going to die, and I know that's going to be upsetting to certain people, but the life is like that. Horrible things happen in life, and things happen in life that influence the great narrative that you live. And so sometimes you have to write those things.
Well, and I think that's necessary. I mean, a criticism I have of the Marvel movies is no one's really ever dead.
Yes.
It is the pain. I mean, I think they've confirmed Robert Downey Jr. is not coming back, but in especially comic book stuff, death has no meaning because eventually they bring people back. And I remember back in because I nerd out on this history of comics more than actually the comics themselves. When Norman Osborn in the Spider-Man run, he had died at some point. And then they had written themselves into a hole with this one character. And they're like, oh, who's been doing all this? Who's this mystery person? Because it's easy to make, as J.J. Abrams has proven, it's easy to make a box and say, oh, wonder what's in it, and never put something in it. They didn't actually write an ending. So they're like, well, who's going to do it? Well, there's only one person. It could be Norman Osborn. Wouldn't the fans love that? But there was one comics guy that was like, his ending was too perfect. You are going to, he should not be the person to it. You don't want to do it, but it's the easy thing rather than the right thing.
Yeah, like Emperor Palpatine coming back in the last Skywalker. They missed the opportunity to make that Darth Jar Jar. Everyone would have loved that.
Oh, that would have been fascinating. I mean, don't get me started on The Rise of Skywalker. I'm one of the few apologists, not few, but I'm one of the apologists for The Last Jedi. I know it has flaws, but I
enjoy it as well, actually.
And this is something where I actually want to ask you a little bit, because we're going to talk here in a moment about your view on Bond. But as a writer, you see movies differently, I'm guessing, the same as I do. So when I watch The Last Jedi, I'm like, okay, I see where he's going. I like the fact he's asking big ideas in this. And then I watched The Rise of Skywalker and I'm like, oh, they literally just gutted anything that was interesting to give you a bland, what you think you want.
100%. And I mean, The Last Jedi was all about subverting expectations. So we left Luke at the end of Return of the Jedi as this elegant, controlled, super principled Jedi. And then he became this wreck of a broken man. I heard this thing the other day that completely justified why they did this, though. It's like there's this, it all comes down to the scene of Ben waking up and there's Luke igniting his lightsaber about to attack him. And everyone's like, Luke would never do that. Why would you do that? The theory was that Luke saw a vision of Ben or Kylo killing Han. And that was the one thing that broke Luke's like serenity. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, wow, okay, now I'm sold. Now this twist that I hated in The Last Jedi, I'm behind. And I like the way they subverted each character and they subverted expectations of what you thought was going to happen. Didn't happen. I respected that. And you're right. When they then had The Last Skywalker and they basically like retconned all of that, I hated it because it felt like the investment I'd made and the risk I'd taken by believing in this all got taken away from me.
Well, and that's another part that I enjoy about, I think it's a realistic version because I love the Greek myths.
Yeah.
And those heroes it's very hard for a hero to have a good ending, is the painful reality that I've come to. If you look at most stories, most heroes don't end well. Usually they are tragic ends. So when Luke gets to that point, it doesn't surprise me. He's gone through so much, and that's the typical narrative thrust. And then, of course, there has to be that heroic sacrifice at the end. It's that grand narrative.
Yeah, and it's tough and you think about that real life. You think of the heroes in your own life and how they might have actually ended up dying. And yeah, it's like dying of old age. That's maybe what you supposed to be doing, but that can be hugely undignified to people who are heroic. But then dying before their time, that can seem so sad because of the wasted potential. I don't think there is any satisfying way to end somebody's life, but to have a character who at least kind of redeems themselves or goes through a loop and ends up where they should be, and then end of story. As long as you keep them dead, I think that's good.
So I think what we've found is a perfect Bond-like title. Death is never satisfying, or something like that.
Ooh, that's quite interesting. I might take that.
Please feel free, take that.
Run and that's legally binding. Everyone legally binding. To this. If I write "Death is never satisfying," Terrence Mayhew gets none of the royalties.
None of the royalties. I'm not going to Kevin McClory you. Just put an acknowledgement at the back of the book. Let's talk a little bit about James Bond here, because I think that you have assumed a great position in the Bond community that we're both a part of, where you get to be, at least it seems like lately, especially, you're the go-to guy about talking about the books, which is amazing and wonderful. Tell me a little bit about how you became a James Bond fan. And if you don't mind me asking, do you have a favorite book?
I feel very honored to have been invited to so many things within the Bond community because of my love of books and storytelling. And I know there are so many people who are so knowledgeable about the books. Joe Darlington from being James Bond, like the first time they had one of these pandemic Zoom calls or something, he went through the history of the Bond books and was so knowledgeable. and so smart about it. So I'm very, very grateful to have been involved. But I love it because as a writer, I think you get an interesting perspective on the books that perhaps people who just enjoy them as books don't. Like, I can understand the challenges that Ian Fleming had. I can respect his brevity in the terms of writing, his economy of words, but the way he picks the perfect words is just such a brilliant style of writing, and he's very quotable. But then again, I can also see where his stories fall apart. Like Goldfinger is both my favorite and my least favorite book, because some of the writing and the characters are amazing, and then the plot is a flaming dumpster fire by the end. And The Man with the Golden Gun, I actually enjoyed that a lot, because to see it, the first half, I think he adds a lot that perhaps the second half, even though it's unfinished, is a very quick, enjoyable read because it's kind of stripped down. And so it's interesting though to be able, it's like walking into a house and peeling back the wallpaper and seeing the structure. And I found The Man with the Golden Gun was great because it's like walking into a half-built house and seeing how he assembled it. And you can then compare his writing and his plots to other stories and other plot dynamics and the structure of storytelling in different mediums. And I really enjoy being able to dissect it forensically. So I really enjoy Ian Fleming that way. And I think because he's only got 12 books, he's not still alive, he's not still writing. I think there is so much everyone can find within them. I mean, there's License to Queer and a lot of LGBTQA plus people who find a lot within the James Bond books that they can resonate with, that the interests, the little threads that they can pull. And I love that, because then there are the people who, could be the complete other spectrum, who are into guns. Like Commando Bond is a great Instagram account. And it's like, it's great to see the context that he brings to discussions about that. And so many different elements are so interesting when you can dive deep into them. And I love the way there have been certain characters and certain people within the Bond community who have just specialized in certain areas, just to such an amazing thing. I mean, to listen to like Bond suits and the Bond experience and From Tailors with Love discussing all of the different clothing choices, and when they have Bond's apartment in as well. I mean, I'm like, I have no idea what they're talking about when they're talking about these particular suit details, but I'm fascinated. So amazing to see people having the opportunity to really nerd out on the things about Bond that they really love, and then you make connections. Like you and I, the discussions we've been having about storytelling and story structure and stuff, it's like, it's great. And we have the same sandbox of James Bond to play in. It's like that. It's a big sandbox that we can all come in and play in and find toys within that sandbox that we really love.
Well, I think it's so impressive is, like you said, it's 12 books and 2 short story collections.
Yeah.
Which from that, and then like 26 movies. And we have that as like our infrastructure, that there's so much within. I absolutely love the economy of Fleming's writing. I'm one of those people that call me just bored, but I don't enjoy like a lot of modern thrillers these days. Just keep getting fatter on the shelf. And I'm like, I don't know. I'd really rather like have a crisp, quick page turner rather than something that feels like we're dragging the story on for the sake of getting a certain size book, instead of having just a compelling, quick story. And Fleming's they're not light and breezy, but they are economic. They're kind of like that Ernest Hemingway, in that they are that economy of words. Not only that, but since I've gotten into the pulp community and those noir books, and there's a wonderful interview you can listen between Ian Fleming and it's not Dashiell Hammett. Yes, Raymond Chandler. And that's just amazing because, again, both of them were writing at the same time. And so you really get a sense of how Fleming is really taking a lot of influences from this noir genre in the States. And it was fascinating.
Yeah, and his writing evolved from that. And it's I love that. And I think you're absolutely right. The next big thing I think in writing is going to be making things bite-sized. I just read With a Mind to Kill by Anthony Horowitz, and that took me a day to read.
Yep.
And that's perfect because that way you don't need to invest massively in it. And yet you have the same context to discuss things. I've had so many really amazing discussions with people in the Bond community. Like the Bond's Basement just started off a new podcast. What's it called?
Inflated Opinions.
Yes, give a shout out to him. And that was fun because we were discussing something we both had the context of having read. And shorter is better in that way. It's it's difficult to commit to a huge, massive book. And I'm the worst at like the sprawl of books. And my next book, I'm going to really try from now on to make them all pocket sized because of that.
Well, I think it's interesting because it kind of reminds me of the idea of singles and in films. Films. Now, despite the fact we're making movies longer and longer, there's that idea where the shorter a movie is, the more often you can play it.
Yeah.
A single can be played more times than a full album.
Yep.
So books.
We've all got short attention spans these days.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about it, it's like there have been many occasions I've been on YouTube sitting down, like I'm going to watch something, and I'm like, 15 minutes. I haven't got 15 minutes. So if you want to be successful on YouTube, keep your videos to 5 minutes because people will invest 5 minutes in you. And I've found that in my own personal stuff. I make videos. If I ramble for 45 minutes, you have people dropping off after 10 minutes. And when you write books that are 160,000 words, people don't read all the way through. So being able to be disciplined with yourself and put things into a much more bite-sized thing, I think is a really valuable skill that creative people should focus on moving forward.
I'm excited. My swashbuckler, it's only 40,000 words, which is actually almost half of what my romance novel was. Romance novel was like 67. So I'm going to be very curious to see how that actually does in terms of the read through, because the chapters I also wrote were shorter, trying to make it more of a clip running through.
As you know, 40,000 words, I think, is going to be the sweet spot moving forward. And it doesn't give you much to play with. But then again, The Man with the Golden Gun was an exciting story. That was 40,000 words. So, that's a good length. And if you can have the discipline to put that in there, it's not just about the story. It's not just about the characters. It's not just about the writing. It's about packaging it together in a way that readers, are willing to embrace. And
I'm sorry for interrupting, but I'm just curious, as we're getting close to, I think, the end of the conversation here, what would you say advice to beginning self-published authors? I'll happily take any, but people that are listening that want to get involved in this, where should they go for resources? And then what do you think, because I've seen a couple of your YouTube videos, you have said that you kind of have like the idea of the perfect, this is what makes the perfect self-published book. Would you mind sharing that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that's really important. If I could go back in time and do it again, I would not. People approach it by writing the story first and then figuring out how they're going to sell it later. The best advice I could have, which is advice I'd never follow, like all the best advice is write the blurb to your book first. So write the little thing that's going to be on the back, because in that you have to come up with whatever it is that's compelling and exciting to the reader. And if you haven't started your book, that gives you an opportunity to figure out what is exciting and compelling to write about. And so I never take this advice, but write your blurb first, and then it sets you up to really focus on the things that are going to appeal most to potential readers. And then I think it's very important to do a lot of research, find the books that inspired you, and learn what elements, not that you copy, but that you share. I think the book High Point, when I did the male cover, I designed the cover to have elements in common with Clive Cussler books. Like Clive Cussler books always have a boat doing something exciting on the cover. The writing style, it's not the same font, it's not the same color, but the proportions are the same as a Clive Cussler book. So when you go onto Amazon and you see this book next to a Clive Cussler book, they look kind of the same, or they at least give the unspoken promise to the reader. Hey, this guy gets it. This guy knows about, if he gets the cover elements right, he probably gets the story elements right, and I'll probably enjoy it. So do a ton of research. And what you want to do is package your book up to look appropriate alongside other books in that genre, like you did. I've got with Reason and Romance, would look perfectly in place next to Tessa Bailey's book, and Tessa Bailey sells gazillions of books. So you need to get the dress code right. Like you go to ambassador's reception, you need to be wearing the tuxedo. But to really, really make a difference, you then need to have something about it shine, that zestiness that we were talking about earlier. So with me, I did all of the covers and the tattoos of the shirtless guys, which is very in keeping, but I tended to make them a little more colorful. And I did one thing. You'll notice the gun that each of the characters is wearing goes on top of the title of the book rather than behind the title of the book. Just little elements like that make it a little zestier and attract people's eye, and they're like, oh, all of the elements are right, but there's something spicy about it, and that's why I want to do it. And you talked about exactly that with Reason and Romance. You wanted to write something that is satisfying and familiar to people, yet add that zesty elements. They're like, ooh, picante.
Another question I wanted to ask is, since you're also well read, Are there any books that you'd like to recommend to the audience, or what are you reading right now?
Right now, I am reading, believe it or not, The Great Gatsby, because I haven't read that in a while. And I'm very great. Of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald was great friends with Ernest Hemingway. Yeah, and in Ernest Hemingway's book, A Movable Feast, I think he talks about a road trip he took with Fitzgerald, which is fascinating. And so that's really interesting to read. And I think there is always value in reading classics, even if you haven't read them before. What's the last book I read? I read your book. I had an advanced reading copy of Kim Sherwood's Double O trilogy, and that was really exciting to be given the opportunity to read. But I try and always have a book on the go. And we have so many books everywhere that there are always gazillions that I haven't read. Buying books and reading books are two different hobbies, as Dorothy Parker said.
Sadly true.
So what are you reading right now?
Right now, oh dear gosh, I'm reading the 5th book in the legendary Lyman Chronicles, which is
Dorothy
Dunnett.
Yes.
It's a pawn in frankincense, so it's a good series. I definitely recommend it to people. And if you haven't read her books, delightful characters.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of Lee Child as well, and I enjoy reading books like that because you can learn so much from the craft of writer reading that. It's like Lee Child is a phenomenal writer.
I had never read him before, but I'd seen the Reacher series, and now I'm like, I have to start reading the Jack Reacher books.
They are brilliant. I mean, they're the male voice, so they might not appeal to somebody who reads romance books, but the economy of his writing and the vividness is just excellent. He's a very Kim Sherwood is going to do an amazing job with the next trilogy of books. And then for a writer after that, if they had Lee Child coming in, I would be very happy with that. I think he would do a fantastic job.
Well, Roland, this has been an amazing conversation. I've had such a great time. Where can people go to learn more about you, your work, and your books?
I would go to Amazon and type in Roland Hulme with an L, or look me up on Instagram. I do have a website as well, but I think it's broken at the moment. So yeah, just type in my name though, and I come up everywhere. I'm like a bad penny.
Love it. Well, thank you again for coming on the show.
Oh, well, Terence, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.